Today's going to be a good one. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We have another great story today. I decided to do this one because my mom actually told me, I'm pretty sure Roald Dahl has a pretty crazy story. So I was like, I'm doing that one next. First off, sorry if you can hear it a little bit. I'm a little bit still sick. We've just gotten slammed with sickness here. We had like the norovirus, which luckily I dodged that. Then we got hit with like a respiratory infection, and I'm currently like 35 weeks pregnant. I couldn't take like anything for it, so I was down for the count for about a whole week. It was terrible. So sorry if you can still hear it in my sinuses. I think it's almost pretty much gone. I'm feeling much more like myself, so I'm very, very glad. And I am so excited to do the story today because it's freaking wild. So please make sure to Please make sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you around. I am a children's book author and illustrator, but I'm inspired by the classics. And so I decided to start this deep dive series because I just wanted to know more. So I talk about everything children's books here, so make sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you around. All right, so Roald Dahl was actually born on September 13th in 1916 in Llandaff, Wales. Sorry if I just offended like a whole country. I'm just not good with all the names. So just sorry. So he was actually born to Norwegian parents, and his father Harold, he was actually married prior, and he had 2 children with his first wife, but then she unfortunately passed away. So then that's when Harold met Roald's mom, Sophie. And then that's where Roald comes in the picture. And then they ended up having some kids together, including Roald. So that's kind of where Roald comes in, and like just more about his parents. So he was like, he grew up speaking Norwegian, and that was like the household that he grew up in. And fun fact about Roald, he's actually named after a Norwegian polar explorer. And this explorer's name was Roald Amundsen. Say again, I'm butchering it. I'm sorry. So it was actually quite sad when Roald was growing up. So his sister Astrid actually died when she was very, very young, and she was only 7 years old, and it was from appendicitis. And so it was very hard on the family because at the time Roald was only 3 years old himself. So it was a huge loss for him to lose his sister at such a young age. Just several weeks later, after Astrid died, that's when Harold died. So that's when Roald's father died from pneumonia. So it was a lot of death at the same time. And then actually later that same year is when his younger sister was born. So Sophie was currently pregnant, and then when the father had died, and then so she ended up having her baby later that year. So it was just a crazy time for the family, lots of loss, but then they also had this baby who came. So it was kind of just a crazy time. Now, before Harold died, he had actually expressed that his wish for his kids was to be educated in the English school system because he personally believed that those schools were so much better off and they were some of the best in the world. And so he was wanting to just give his kids kind of the best opportunity possible. And so fulfilling his wish, Sophie actually stayed in England so the kids could get educated in the English school systems. And so instead of like going back to Norway, like where family was, she stayed in England so the kids could be educated there. And I just have to include this one fun fact because I felt a bunch of jealousy bubble up out of the surface when I saw that Roald actually met Beatrix Potter when he was 6. And she was like his idol. And I just about had a hissy fit. For anyone who doesn't know, she is like my muse. I love her. You can see a lot of her inspiration in like my first children's book, right back there. Absolutely love her. I would have absolutely died. So the first school that Roald actually attended was Llandaff. Don't come after me. Catholic school. And it was actually when he was 8 years old. So there was this thing that had happened where he was with some friends, and they were at a local sweet shop, and they decided to play a prank. So they took a dead mouse and placed it into the jar of like a jar of gobstoppers. And because apparently the boys like loved gobstoppers, especially they were like a personal favorite of Roald's, especially through both like World Wars. He kind of mentions that later. But so they put the mouse in there, and they did it kind of especially because the owner of the sweet shop, her name was Miss Pratchett, and they said that she was just a mean and loathsome woman. They just could not stand her. She was very mean. And so they kind of ultimately played the prank on her for that, and they got in huge trouble. It's also rumored that this Mrs. Pratchett, she was actually the inspiration for Miss Trunchbull later in Matilda. So, I mean, if you don't know, if you're not around a lot, Matilda's like one of his most famous works. So then because of the whole practical joke, he was then moved into St. Peter's School. And so this one, Sophie decided to put him here because I guess it was just like it worked out well, like with the ferry system and things like that, but he was still away from home because it was like technically a boarding school. And so he ended up riding home every single week. And he was very, very homesick at this time. And he just had a really, really hard time, but he never really admitted it to his mom. He just kind of held it kind of close to the chest. I don't think he really wanted to bother her with that because, I mean, there was really only so much that could be done. But then he later found out that when she died, that she had actually saved every single one of his letters that he had written her. They were actually read aloud on like a radio broadcast, like in a bridge version. And so it was just really sweet to hear that she had actually saved all of these letters, especially at a really hard time for him. I don't think he really realized like how much she was doing in the background. So then later in 1929, at the age of 13, this is when Roald actually goes to the school called Repton. And he really had a problem here because they still practiced corporal punishment, and he just had a really hard time. I guess there was lots of hazing that was going on with the boys at the school. And so he just had a really, really hard time with all of this. And he just really, really resented it. And he even goes on to talk later about how he genuinely couldn't understand how an adult who is especially like in a teacher position or like a headmaster position could like be free to inflict pain and harm onto like a student. He could not understand that. He couldn't really wrap his mind around it. And he said he never got over that. That always stayed with him. Now, throughout his childhood, Roald always kind of had this like innate sense to want to adventure out and like go see more and do more. So when the time came for him to go to higher education, and he was really, really good like academically, and so his mom actually offered to pay for his schooling, like kind of wherever he wanted to go, because he was so good. And remember, this was also kind of the dream of the dad for his kids to get just really, really good education. And he ended up turning it down. He just wanted more. He wanted more adventure. He wanted to go see the world. He wanted to experience other things. And so he didn't want to do it. And so actually when his mom had offered this to him, his response was this. He said, "No, thank you. I want to go straight from school to work for a company that will send me to wonderful faraway places like Africa or China." And so I believe I read that he joined an expedition to Newfoundland, and he did this instead of going to like college. And then, of course, when the war hit, he did join the Royal Air Force, and he did spend his time in the Royal Air Force. And then actually there was a point where he actually was like a spy. So I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Okay, so now we're going to jump into some of his works. But before we do, we're going to take a really quick break. Today's video is sponsored by my company, the Lavender Book Company, where I'm very passionate about bringing classic feeling books to the modern child. So my first book, The Adventure of Theodore James, follows a little mouse who is lacking his own abilities, but it's through an adventure he realizes he has the ability within himself to conquer any fear. And with my books, just know that you're going to get high quality all around. But not only do I have my first book available right now, but I also have some Kindle charms, chain bookmarks, some ribbon bookmarks that are on clearance, and then my second children's book is actually going to be coming out very, very soon. So make sure to go down in the description. You can even sign up for my email list and get some extra insider information as well. So let's get back to the story. Welcome back. One of his first works was The Gremlins, and this was actually for Walt Disney. Walt Disney had like commissioned this, and it was supposed to become a movie. That was like kind of the plan. But then it never happened. And so the work, like the project was ultimately shelved, and I read it was kind of for different reasons. But one of the reasons they kind of mentioned was by the time that the book was written and kind of the time period, people were just kind of sick of like war stuff. They didn't want to see any more war stuff. And that was kind of one of the big storylines like in this whole book and like in this storyline. And so they just decided to shelve it. And so nothing really came of it. Now, he spent a lot of time kind of writing a bunch of different stuff. I mean, he wrote like more of like adult stories or like military things. But he finally got like bestseller status with his book called Someone Like You. So also this same year is where he meets Patricia Neal, so his first wife. They met at a party that was hosted by Lillian Hellman. And she like introduced them and they kind of hit it off. And so later in her life, Patricia, later in Patricia's life, she had actually kind of brought up each other meeting. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with words today. And she mentioned how they were both in a place in their life where they were ready for marriage. Because at the time, Patricia was an actress herself. So Roald was this up-and-coming author, and then Patricia was this actress. So she mentioned that they were both in a place for them to get married. They wanted to be married, but they always still kind of held this reservation about getting married. Like, ooh, are we doing it? Which I feel like always happens, because that's a huge milestone in your life. When you always are just like, I'm hoping this is the right decision. You know what I mean? I think everyone feels that way just because it's so monumental. It's such a big thing, and you want to make a really good decision on that. Now, actually, in the first 6 months of their marriage, Patricia had mentioned how they actually almost split up within the first 6 months. What was really hard for the couple was kind of almost like the converging of cultures, because Roald was from England and Patricia was from America. So she kind of mentions how she was kind of like your stereotypical kind of American actress. There was just different expectations with like an American housewife versus like a British housewife. And so they both had kind of different expectations on like what was going to be happening and like the roles between them. And so she said that this caused like a big problem between them, but thankfully they like managed to kind of figure it out. And I can relate a lot to this because my husband and I were both from the US, okay? But my husband grew up in Utah. I grew up in Virginia. And you don't think that there would be a lot of like cultural differences, but there are. So I can relate to this. This is like something that we had to kind of figure out when we got married. So I totally relate. So unfortunately, their marriage was not immune to any tragedy by any means. They actually had a lot of tragedy when it came to their marriage. So they ended up having 5 kids total. So unfortunately, their one child, Olivia, she died from the measles. And this was extremely, extremely hard for the couple, which rightfully so. This is like, I think any parent's biggest nightmare and biggest fear is to lose a child in any form or shape or way or anything like that. It's like any parent's biggest nightmare. And so the couple had a really, really hard time, and they both like started questioning like their Christian faith, and they just couldn't understand why if there was a God, why would he allow this to happen? And so they both just like really, really struggled. So then their son Theo, so when he was about 4 months old, he was in his little baby carriage and he actually got struck by a taxi. So this caused him to have a really severe brain injury. And I do believe he was able to recover from this, but it took a long, long time. So it was, again, very, very hard on the couple. And then later, when Patricia was actually pregnant with their 5th kid, she was about 5 months pregnant, she had a 3-burst brain aneurysm. That's insane. So she had to learn how to like talk again and walk again, and Roald had helped her like relearn how to talk and walk. And this portion of their lives was actually then dramatized into a movie in 1981 called The Patricia Neal Story. And so it's just a movie kind of documenting like this portion of their lives. Now, at one point, Roald did make a huge shift and just kind of focused more so on like children's books. And we know him best for some of his for some of his works like The Big Friendly Giant and James and the Giant Peach, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Matilda. Now, for anyone who has read his books or kind of knows of his style, his books can have a lot of like darker humor to them, and they typically always showcase like a villainous adult who mistreats children in some way, and then it's usually the child who kind of triumphs in the end, and good triumphs over bad, and all those kinds of things. So he always wanted to like highlight really good qualities and have that like triumph over whatever obstacle or evil that the child was facing. And so he did go on to say later that children are highly critical and they tend to lose interest very quickly. And so in a New York Times review, he just mentions that whoa, how does that happen? He mentions you have to keep things ticking along, and if you think a child is getting bored, you must think up something that jolts it back, something that tickles and something that children like. And so while he was also writing children's books, he even actually wrote a couple movie scripts as well. He wrote movie scripts for You Only Live Twice, which was in 1967, and then he also helped co-write the script for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Now, in 1983, this is where he ends up divorcing his wife, Patricia. And so I looked into why. And Roald? So she had found out that, so they had a friend, like kind of like a mutual friend between the couple. Her name was Felicity, and it came to light that he was having an affair with her for about a decade. And I did read some areas. Some accounts said that the children knew, some didn't. So I don't know about that. But they were having an affair this whole time. So yeah, so this was very, very hard, obviously. And so the couple ended up getting divorced. And then Roald decided to go and marry Felicity, who she had divorced her husband, who she was also married to at the time. So very messy situation. So, and then he was also married to Felicity until his death in 1990 when he was 74. Now, Roald had a lot of works, okay? He did a lot of stuff. I could go on for probably 5 or 10 minutes just like listing all of his stuff, but we don't have the time for that. But I think we can all just kind of collectively realize that the works that he did create were very, very important. And I feel like there's not many times where, because there's so many authors. There's so many authors who write so many amazing books. But it's like every once in a while you get these authors who create books and stories that just become like part of the culture. They become integrated into people's childhoods, and they just become like so much bigger than like anticipated. And, and I think Roald Dahl was one of those people. I just don't think we can really say otherwise, because you look at all the works that have become so famous and everything that has kind of spawned off of that. When you have jokes and stuff in culture and society that make jokes back to like different works and stuff of these people, I feel like, yeah, that's a really successful person. I don't want to say this. I'm not just painting a brush over all the other things that have gone on, because we will get there. Okay, I left time at the end to go over all the other crazy stuff. So do not fret. I will get there. So I'm not painting a brush of like basically ignorance to everything, but I think we do need to take a second and just realize that what he did create and what he kind of put out there was just absolutely crazy. And so with all this like success, also came a lot of like adaptations for his stuff. I wanted to bring us to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the movie, as you know, because the book is called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And so they had actually included Roald on this adaptation. He was over like the screenplay and the writing adaptation for this movie initially, but he was not hitting his deadlines. And as you guys know, when it comes to Hollywood or anything like that, they're not messing around. They want to keep things moving, when they want to. So after he wasn't meeting deadlines, they brought in like a brand new writer, and he kind of came in and like rewrote the movie, like, and the screenplay and the adaptation and stuff. And so when Roald actually like saw the movie and saw the way it was done, he totally disowned it. He was not having it. He was mad that they put so much emphasis on Willy Wonka and not on Charlie, because the book, when you read the actual book, there is more focus on Charlie. And because in the end, that's your character. That's like your hero character. And so he wanted the emphasis there. And so he was very upset that they spent so much energy and the focus mainly was on Willy Wonka. Because they were planning on creating other adaptations down the line. But because of this scenario and what had happened, he was like, nope, ex-nay, we're not doing any more. No more. We're not doing anything else. So he put a stop to it. He didn't want to do any other adaptations down the line. And it was because of this whole thing. And like, I totally understand that when you're taking a book and you're moving it to like a TV show or like a movie, things will have to get cut. Things will probably have to get rewritten. You know, I get that, but I can see where he's coming from because, I mean, you're talking about like the main core of the book. You're talking about like the main character. You're talking about the main drive, the overall message. I mean, that to me, I could totally understand where he's coming from that. I mean, that's not like a wardrobe change. That's not like a setting change. That's like a huge thing. So I can totally see where he's coming from on that. I mean, because I just think too, like if it was my own book, because like for my first book, so my main character is Theodore, the little mouse. And so it would be like someone making a movie or a show about it, but then making most of the focus on the owl in the book instead of on him, when he's supposed to be the main focus. He's supposed to be the character who gets like the praise and the triumph at the end. So I can see it. I could see why he's irritated. So now I wanted to leave time at the end to go over all the criticism and the controversy surrounding Roald Dahl, because this is just part of the Roald Dahl story. And so I feel like you have to include it. You can't just like bypass it. You can't brush over it because it is part of the whole thing. So the first thing I want to talk about is people's issues with his depictions on the adult characters in his books. So a lot of people have said that they feel like the characters, like the adult ones, are just portrayed just like very, very harshly. And they feel like he just kind of went over the top on it. And they're worried just basically that it would kind of warp kids' sense of adults. Now, then other people have said, well, you know, he was just kind of preparing kids for kind of the evils of life, because unfortunately, as much as we try to shield our kids from things and kind of protect them for a certain amount of time, right? Because you can't protect them for forever. But as much as we would like to kind of shield them as much as we can for as long as we can, sometimes that's not the case for all kids. Sometimes they don't really have advocates kind of with them protecting them. And so some kids are kind of just thrust into certain situations or have to be involved with certain people. And so this was his way of kind of warning those kids, but ultimately showing them that like these good traits do triumph in the end, whether it feels like it or not in the moment, like in the end, like these are the things that do triumph. And I think too, people need to realize like also where he's coming from. Like from his own childhood. Like this was like his childhood that he experienced. He had a very hard time at some of the boarding schools that he was at. He was on the receiving end of some of the corporal punishments and like the brutal kind of cruelty that went on at some of these schools. And it was a lot of these experiences that he had that became the inspiration for his books. So I think people need to understand, like, in a sense, he's kind of writing from his own experience and what he knows and from his childhood. And he's using those things to write his storyline. So that's his experience. That's what his life was, unfortunately. And that's kind of how he viewed some of the adults in his life. So then later, he was actually under fire for some anti-Semitic comments. And so I wanted to include this part, and because I had heard this claim of his anti-Semitic comments, but I didn't see anyone really specifically mentioning what they were. And So I wanted to find out what it was. I wanted to see where it stemmed from, and I found it. Okay, I'm just going to quickly finish my eyes just real fast while I'm not talking. There's an art to having this all finished at the same time, and most of the time I just get busy talking with my hands instead of using my hands to do my face. So let me hurry and do this real fast. Okay, there we go. So now I'm all caught up. I don't have to worry about doing anything else. So where the anti-Semitic comments came in is Dahl was actually doing a review on a children's book called Child Cries. And this was a picture book that was kind of about the siege of Lebanon in 1982 from the Israeli army. And you can definitely tell that Dahl's comments and his kind of messages in the review are from like a certainly like emotionally charged place. And while I do understand his frustrations in a lot of sense, there was of course some things that were said that were just way too far, way too beyond. And you kind of start to lose the plot a little bit. And now I'm going to go ahead and just read this stuff out so then you guys can kind of deduce what you feel and let me know what you think down below. Because I could kind of understand his comments in the beginning, but then as I kept reading, I was like, and you glossed me. And now we're no longer on the same page. I could kind of understand where you were coming from. Now, not so much anymore. Okay, so I'm going to read this. I'm just going to read it verbatim because I don't want to screw it up. I don't want to misquote anything. So this is kind of what he had said when he was doing his review for this book. So until this point in time, a quote, race of people, meaning the Jews, had never, quote, switched so rapidly from much pitied victim to barbarous murderers. The empathy of all after the Holocaust had turned into, quote, hatred and revulsion. Dahl then wrote that Clifton's book would make readers, quote, violently anti-Israeli, saying, and then this is what he says, quote, I am not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Israel. And then he asked this. So up to this point, I was like, look, I'm not saying he's right or whatever in his assumptions or anything. I think we can relate this kind of to the Russia and Ukraine war, right? I mean, I don't hate all Russians because of what Russia, the government chooses to do. So I am of course not anti-Russian. I'm not anti anything like that because I understand that not everybody is part of that. Now I can understand the emotional trigger to all of this stuff, but at the same time, this stuff is way too far. And so then what he says next is when he really loses it for me and he really, really loses the plot. So he asked, quote, must Israel, like Germany, be brought to her knees before she learns how to behave in this world? And I mean, obviously he was in World War II, so he did experience this. So he's also going to have a lot of emotional reaction in that sense. But again, it's you can express your frustrations and your emotions on an event without condemning an entire group of people because not everyone is involved in that. And it's a very dangerous move to make where you just kind of brush everybody with the same stroke. That's a very bold claim to make. Even with the Germans, I know that they were just as appalled by the Holocaust as the world was, but it was just where they happened to be living and, having their families where they were just kind of tied into the German group. And so this stuff is very, this is the stuff in history that becomes where you have to kind of take everything into account and kind of give grace in some areas, but then realize in other areas, no, that is wrong. We can say for a fact, that is wrong. But then in other areas, we can say, okay, well, I can understand where you're coming from on this, so it's I think this is why history is so important and why we have to always be talking about it is because sometimes there's a lot of shades of gray to certain things. I'm not saying all things, so don't misquote me, okay? But certain things in history, you can see there's a lot more going on than just something that's very black and white. Now this next part is what really started to irritate me when I was reading this. This is where I completely understand some people's reactions to his comments. This is to me where he really dug himself into a hole. Following the review, he had an interview with a journalist and it was kind of referencing this review that he had done. And so this is what he had to say. He said, quote, there's a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. Maybe it's a kind of lack of generosity towards non-Jews. I mean, there is always a reason why anti-anything crops up anywhere. Even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason. I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. I don't even know what to say to that. I mean, that's like where you really lose me on that. At this time too, he was an older man because this was like in the 80s. He died in 1990. So, I mean, this was like closer to the end of his life. So later he was asked about it. He was asked about this whole review and like what he said, and he just kind of brushed it off. He's like, you know what? I'm an old guy. Like, I don't have time to basically deal with you guys. You know, people close to him were almost kind of confused from the whole thing because he had people very close to him who were Jews, and he had very good feelings about them, and they got along well. And so some people just said, you know, I just think a lot of people around him thought he was just being very childish in the way he was reacting to this, and they just thought it was like over the top, and it was a very emotional reaction. And so then for him to just kind of totally disregard the whole thing, it just continued to make the whole situation a whole lot worse. Now later on, after he died, the family then came out later and kind of issued an apology for the stuff that he had said. And there were some groups who like accepted this apology and they kind of just moved on. And then there was other groups who kind of just dug their heels in and they didn't really accept it, and they weren't happy with it. So then he was also kind of under fire for some like racial and stereotypes. Now, the racial ones, I think, mainly come into play with the original depiction of the Oompa Loompas in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which this was then later changed. And then for the ones, I think people are kind of referencing like the stuff that I mainly saw when I was looking at this specific like issue that people had like against the sexual stereotypes. A lot of people were referencing the Witches book that he did. So when I heard the quotes and the passages that people were referencing from the Witches book, I personally, myself, I personally did not find issues with it. I feel like I knew what he was trying to say in the book. I personally didn't have an issue with it. I think that's going to be up to each person to kind of decide what they're comfortable with and what they find appropriate and whether or not that offends them or not. But for me personally, in that specific instance, I personally did not have a problem with that. Now, in this last part, I wanted to take a second to talk about this because I feel like when I started diving down this rabbit hole, this was like something totally else. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, now we're in a totally different topic, which I feel like we could do a whole separate video on this, and I may even dive into a whole separate thing on this. But so in 2023, Puffin Books, who owns the rights to all of Roald Dahl's books, they decided to take it upon themselves to get sensitivity writers and go through the books and change things within the books without any consent. I think the whole idea of the sensitivity writers is this is a very slippery slope because this kind of stuff will change as time goes on, because this is just what happens with the world. So I feel like this is going to be constantly like a sliding scale. This is a moving scale. And I think that if an author has passed, then the book should not be touched. I think it's completely different if an author themselves wants to go back in and change a book and they say themselves off their own volition that, hey, you know what? I don't agree with the wording that I used X amount of years ago. Let me go in and change it and give a new version. I think that's totally fine if the author wants to do that themselves. Now, in this specific case, Roald had specifically said before he died, he did not want his books to be touched. He did not want the books to be touched. And so I think the fact that like Puffin Books went in and just changed the books, I think that is a very, very slippery slope. These books written a while ago can offer a really great opportunity for teaching and for conversations. And I think there's a real good reason why, and I hope high schools are still doing this, where there's reasons why we still read books like Huckleberry Finn. and even like To Kill a Mockingbird. There's things in those books that today we don't deem appropriate or sensitive to certain groups, but they offer up really good conversations to have with our kids. And this is like the important part of history, is us being open about it and talking about it, so then that way certain things don't repeat. It's when we start to rewrite stuff without talking about it, or trying to just like completely erase something, that's when we are at risk of repeating history. And that's when it becomes really, really dangerous. And so I think, me personally, if the author is passed, then you don't touch the books. You just don't do it. You don't touch it. You don't do it. If you personally don't want to own those books within your home, that's totally fine. If you don't want to read those books, that's totally fine. And I think that needs to just be left up to the consumer to decide what comes in your home and what you spend your money on. But I don't think it's right. So like I said, I think there is more cases of this that have happened, especially more recently. And so I almost want to do like a whole separate video on this, because I think that'd be very interesting. All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that story today. That was quite the story from Roald Dahl. I mean, he definitely had kind of just a crazy childhood between everything he experienced. And you can definitely see in aspects of his adulthood, like kind of where he carries that stuff from his childhood into his adulthood, and where he pulled a whole bunch of inspiration. And I just really like doing these deep dives, because it really gives me more of a complete picture of these authors and explains more as to like where they get their stories and where they get their inspiration. And it also really sheds some light on the fact that these are actual people who made mistakes, and they've said things, and they're real people like everybody else. But it's very interesting to kind of pull the curtain back on the whole thing. So if you have any other authors that you'd be interested in getting a deep dive on, leave them down below. I will add them to my list, and make sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye. So they met at a party that was hosted by the playwright Lillian Hellman. Lillian Hellman. So they met at a party where, but one of their children, the Willy Wonka and the Charlie and the Chocolate. What am I saying? I wanted to bring us to Willy Wonka and the when I was kind of looking into this specific